A merchant stands at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, one of the most hostile places on earth. Behind him, 2 years of travel. Ahead, 2 more. In his caravan, silk from China, worth more than gold in Rome. One long turn means death. One sandstorm means bankruptcy. One raid means everything lost. And yet, he goes. They all go. For centuries, they go. This is the Silk Road. Not a single road, but a web of routes stretching 4,000 miles from the heart of China to the shores of the Mediterranean. A network that connected civilizations that didn't know the other existed. A conduit through which ideas, religions, technologies, and diseases flowed alongside precious cargo. Hello and welcome to Mixed Documentaries, where we trace the invisible threads that connect our modern world to its ancient past. Tonight, we're walking the caravanserai, crossing mountain passes at 15,000 feet, surviving deserts where water is worth more than silk, and watching as empires rise and fall along the greatest trade route in human history. If you're fascinated by how the world became interconnected long before the internet, how a bolt of fabric could reshape kingdoms, or how ideas traveled further than any single person ever could, I'd be grateful if you hit subscribe. It helps us continue exploring the networks that built our world. Let's begin this journey from Chang'an to Constantinople, from the Han Dynasty to the Roman Empire, from merchants to monks, from silk to salvation. This is the story of how trade created the world. The Silk Road didn't start as the Silk Road. It started with a problem. In 138 BC, the Han Dynasty controlled much of China, but they faced a serious threat, the Xiongnu, nomadic warriors who raided the northern borders relentlessly. The Han Emperor Wudi needed allies. He'd heard rumors of powerful kingdoms to the west, beyond the mountains and deserts, enemies of the Xiongnu who might join forces with China. He sent an envoy named Zhang Qian west to find these allies. Zhang Qian's mission failed spectacularly. He was captured by the Xiongnu, held prisoner for 10 years, escaped, continued west, failed to secure any military alliance, was captured again on the return journey, escaped again, and finally made it back to China 13 years after he left. But Zhang Qian brought back something more valuable than military treaties. He brought back information. He'd seen the Fergana Valley, famous for its powerful horses. He'd heard of Parthia, Bactria, and India. He'd learned of products unknown in China, and of Chinese products, especially silk, that were unknown in the West, but would be desperately desired there. The Han court realized something profound. There were wealthy civilizations to the West who would pay extraordinary prices for Chinese goods. And there were goods in the West that China wanted. A market existed. What was needed was a route. Thus began the systematic development of what would become the Silk Road, though that name wouldn't be coined until 1877 by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen. The ancient Chinese called it the Western Regions Road. The merchants who traveled it probably just called it the way to get rich or die trying. But why silk? Why did this particular fabric become the defining commodity of the world's greatest trade route? Silk was a Chinese monopoly. For nearly 3,000 years, only China knew how to produce it. The process of sericulture, raising silkworms and harvesting their cocoons, was a closely guarded state secret. Legend says that anyone who revealed the secret to foreigners would be executed. The Chinese understood that their monopoly was the source of their wealth. In Rome, silk was worth its weight in gold, literally. Roman writers complained about the empire's trade deficit with the East, how Roman gold flowed out to pay for silk that Roman women wore. The Emperor Tiberius even tried to ban men from wearing silk calling it unmanly, though the real reason was probably economic. Silk was light, valuable, and didn't spoil. A merchant could carry a fortune in silk on a few pack animals. It was the perfect long-distance trade route. But silk was just the beginning. The Silk Road carried much more. From China, silk, porcelain, tea, paper, gunpowder, and later printing technology. From Central Asia, horses, jade, furs, and most importantly, served as the middlemen who made the trade possible. From India, spices, textiles, precious stones, and Buddhism. From the Middle East, glassware, carpets, and Islam. From the Mediterranean, gold, silver, wool, wine, and later Christianity. But perhaps more important than any physical goods were the intangibles. Ideas, religions, technologies, art, music, mathematics, medicine. These flowed along the Silk Road like water, seeping into every civilization they touched, changing them, mixing with local traditions, creating something new. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It was the world's first information superhighway. Let me correct a common misconception. There was no single Silk Road. There were many routes, braiding together and splitting apart, forming a complex network that shifted over centuries as political situations. The main routes can be divided into several major arteries, all starting from Chang'an, the capital of the Han Dynasty, today's Xi'an. The northern route went northwest from Chang'an through the Gansu Corridor, past the Jade Gate, and then skirted along the northern edge of the Taklamakan Desert. It passed through oasis cities like Turpan and Urumqi, crossed the Tian Shan Mountains, and continued through the steppes of Central Asia to Samarkand and Bukhara. This route was faster but more exposed to nomadic raids. The terrain was harsh but navigable. Merchants who took this route needed to be tough and well armed. The southern route also left Chang'an, followed the Gansu Corridor, but then curved south around the Taklamakan Desert's southern edge. It passed through oasis cities like Dunhuang, Miran, and Hotan, hugging the base of the Kunlun Mountains. This route was longer but offered some protection from the nomads. The oases were smaller and more isolated. Water was scarcer, but the jade from Hotan alone made this route profitable. The central route went straight through the middle, through the heart of the Taklamakan. This was the route of the desperate or the foolhardy. The Taklamakan's name supposedly means "go in and you won't come out" in Uyghur. Most merchants avoided it entirely. Beyond Central Asia, the roads diverged further. Some went southwest into India through the Khyber Pass. Others continued west through Persia. The main route went through Merv, Nishapur, and Hamadan, eventually reaching the Mediterranean at Antioch or Tyre. The Maritime Silk Road was an alternative that developed later, especially during the Song dynasty. Ships sailed from southern Chinese ports through Southeast Asia, around India, through the Persian Gulf or Red Sea, and on to East Africa and the Mediterranean. This route was faster and could carry more cargo, but it was riskier due to pirates and storms. Let's talk about the journey itself, because understanding the Silk Road requires understanding what it meant to actually travel it. No merchant traveled the entire distance from China to Rome. The journey was too long, too dangerous, too expensive. Instead, goods passed through many hands, bought and sold in trading cities along the road. A bolt of silk might be sold and resold a dozen times, its price multiplying with each transaction, before finally reaching its destination. A typical caravan might consist of dozens or even hundreds of camels, donkeys, or horses, along with merchants, guards, guides, and servants. The two-humped Bactrian camel was the ship of the desert, able to carry 400 pounds, go without water for days, and survive extreme temperature swings. The journey from Chang'an to Samarkand alone took about 6 months in good conditions. From Samarkand to the Mediterranean, another 6 months or more. Most merchants worked a section of the route, buying goods at one trading city and selling them at the next. The physical challenges were immense. The Taklamakan Desert's temperatures could exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit in summer and drop below freezing in winter. Sandstorms could bury entire caravans. Mirages drove men mad. Water sources were days apart, and if an oasis had dried up since the last caravan, everyone died. The mountain passes were equally deadly. The Pamir Mountains, called the roof of the world, required crossing passes above 15,000 feet. At those altitudes, the air is thin, temperatures plummet, and avalanches are common. The Khyber Pass was narrower, lower, but infested with bandits who knew every hiding place. Then there were the human threats: bandits, nomadic raiders, corrupt officials demanding taxes, rival merchants spreading false information about route conditions, con artists in trading cities. Trust was a commodity as valuable as silk. Despite all this, they came. The profits were too enormous to ignore. A successful journey could make a merchant wealthy for life. A single bolt of silk, purchased in China for a few pieces of silver, could sell in Rome for enough gold to buy a small estate. But success was never guaranteed. We know from ancient accounts that many merchants died on the route. Their bones, and sometimes their cargo, are still being discovered in the desert. 1,000-year-old time capsules of commercial ambition and human tragedy. The Silk Road wasn't really about the journey. It was about the destinations. The trading cities, oases in the literal and metaphorical desert, where caravans rested, goods changed hands, and cultures collided. These cities were where the magic happened, where a Buddhist monk from India might share a meal with a Zoroastrian merchant from Persia, where Chinese silk merchants argued with Greek-speaking traders from Bactria, where ideas were exchanged as freely as coins. Let's visit a few of these remarkable places. Dunhuang was the gateway from China proper into the western regions. Located at a crucial junction where the northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan split, Dunhuang was both a commercial center and a spiritual one. The Mogao Caves, carved into cliffs outside the city, contain some of the finest Buddhist art ever created. Over 492 caves, decorated across 1,000 years, filled with murals and sculptures that show not just Buddhist iconography, but also the daily life of Silk Road travelers. We can see caravans, merchants, different ethnic groups, all preserved in pigment and plaster. In 1900, a Taoist monk discovered a sealed cave chamber containing over 50,000 manuscripts and artworks, hidden there probably to protect them from invasion. These documents in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, and other languages have given us an unprecedented window into Silk Road life. Letters, contracts, religious texts, music scores, medical treatises, an entire civilization's paper trail. Kashgar sits at the western end of the Taklamakan, where routes from China, India, and Central Asia converge. For over 2,000 years, Kashgar has been a trading hub. Its Sunday market, which still operates today, once saw merchants from dozens of nations bargaining in a babel of languages. Kashgar was also where cultures truly mixed. The population included Chinese, Uyghurs, Tajiks, Indians, Persians, and Arabs. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Manichaeism all had followers there. The city's architecture reflected this diversity, with Buddhist stupas, Islamic mosques, Christian churches, and Zoroastrian fire temples sometimes standing on the same street. Samarkand was perhaps the greatest of all Silk Road cities. Located in modern Uzbekistan, Samarkand was where the routes from China, India, and Persia met. It was conquered by Alexander the Great, ruled by various Persian empires, and eventually became one of the major cities of the Islamic world. The city's golden age came under Timur in the 14th century, when it became the capital of his empire. He brought artisans, scholars, and architects from across Asia to beautify the city. The Registan, with its 3 madrasas covered in turquoise tiles and geometric patterns, still stands as a monument to that era. But Samarkand was important long before Timur. For centuries, it was where goods from east and west were traded, where prices were set, where information was gathered. Merchants in Samarkand knew what was happening in China months before anyone in Persia did, and vice versa. Information was as valuable as silk, and Samarkand was the stock market of information. Merv in modern Turkmenistan was once one of the largest cities in the world. In the 12th century, it may have had a population of 200,000, larger than London or Paris at the time. It was a center of learning, home to libraries and observatories. Islamic scholars made advances in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine there. Merv was also a manufacturing center. It produced its own textiles, metalwork, and ceramics, goods that flowed both east and west along the Silk Road. The city controlled water resources in an arid region, making it wealthy and powerful. The Mongols destroyed Merv in 1221, massacring most of its population. The city never recovered. Today, it's largely ruins, a reminder that the Silk Road city's prosperity depended on peace and stable rule. Constantinople was the western terminus of the Silk Road, the bridge between Asia and Europe. As capital of the Byzantine Empire, it was fabulously wealthy, its markets filled with goods from 3 continents. Byzantine merchants were the final link in the Silk Road chain, buying goods from Persian or Arab middlemen and selling them throughout Europe. The Byzantine court's appetite for silk, spices, and exotic goods kept the trade flowing. Byzantine gold flowed east, enriching everyone along the road. These cities were more than just marketplaces. They were caravanserais, fortified inns where merchants could rest, store goods, and make deals. They were banks, where merchants could deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another through a system of letters of credit. They were post offices, where news and letters traveled along with goods. They were schools, where translators and guides were trained. They were melting pots, where cuisines, music, art, and ideas from across Asia blended into something new. The Silk Road cities created a cosmopolitan culture that wouldn't be matched until the age of global exploration, 1,000 years later. In these oases, the world was connected, however tenuously, however slowly, for the first time in human history. While silk gave the route its name, the variety of goods that traveled the Silk Road was staggering. Let's examine some of the most important. Silk remained a prestige item throughout the route's history. Chinese silk was unmatched in quality. The secret of silk production finally reached the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century CE, when, according to legend, 2 monks smuggled silkworm eggs out of China hidden in hollow bamboo staffs. But even after this, Chinese silk remained the gold standard. Different qualities and types of silk served different markets. The finest silks, embroidered with gold thread, went to royal courts. Simpler silks served the wealthy merchant class. Silk wasn't just fabric, it was currency. Chinese governments paid nomadic tribes tribute in silk to prevent raids. Merchants used bolts of silk as a medium of exchange. Spices flowed both east and west, but primarily west, from India and Southeast Asia. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These weren't just flavoring. They were preservatives, medicines, and status symbols. In medieval Europe, a pound of pepper could be worth more than a laborer's annual wages. The spice trade was enormously profitable, which is why Europeans later sought direct sea routes to Asia, leading to the Age of Exploration. Columbus was looking for a route to the Spice Islands when he stumbled onto the Americas. Precious stones and metals moved in all directions. Jade from Khotan was prized in China. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan traveled both east and west. It was used in Chinese imperial seals and ground into ultramarine pigment for European Renaissance paintings. Gold and silver served as currency, but also as jewelry and decorative arts. Porcelain was another Chinese monopoly for centuries. Chinese porcelain, called China in English, was stronger, finer, and more beautiful than any ceramics produced elsewhere. The secret of its manufacture, requiring specific types of clay and extremely high firing temperatures, wasn't replicated in Europe until the 18th century. Paper revolutionized the world. Invented in China, the technology spread along the Silk Road. Arabs learned paper making from Chinese prisoners captured at the Battle of Talas in 751 CE. From the Arab world, it spread to Europe. Before paper, writing materials were expensive and rare. Paper made books, records, and eventually printing possible. Glassware moved in the opposite direction. Roman and later Islamic glassmakers produced items prized in China, where glass production was less advanced. Chinese archaeological sites have yielded Roman glass bowls that traveled 4,000 miles. Horses were crucial. Chinese emperors were obsessed with the heavenly horses of Fergana in Central Asia, larger and stronger than Chinese breeds. These horses were military assets, capable of carrying armored cavalry. China traded enormous quantities of silk for relatively few horses, showing how valuable they were considered. Technologies traveled as embodied knowledge. The stirrup, invented in China, revolutionized cavalry warfare worldwide. Gunpowder, also from China, changed military history. The concept of zero in mathematics traveled from India through the Islamic world to Europe. Astronomical observations and instruments moved in all directions. Food crops transformed cuisines. Grapes came to China from Persia. Walnuts and pomegranates traveled east. Later, after the Americas were discovered, crops from the New World like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes entered the Silk Road trade network and spread across Asia. But perhaps the most consequential goods weren't goods at all. They were ideas. The Silk Road's most profound impact wasn't economic. It was cultural and religious. Ideas traveled along the trade routes, sometimes faster than goods, transforming civilizations. Buddhism is the paradigm case. It originated in India in the 6th century BCE, but it spread to China, Central Asia, and eventually East Asia, primarily via the Silk Road. Buddhist monks traveled as missionaries, following the trade low-fast skiing and mystery, where merchants of the country is like to fall. They translated Sanskrit texts into Chinese, often working in translation bureaus attached to Buddhist temples in cities like Dunhuang. The spread of Buddhism also meant the spread of Buddhist art, architecture, philosophy, and practices. Chinese Buddhism developed its own character, blending with Confucianism and Taoism. Chan Buddhism, which later became Zen in Japan, emerged from this cultural mixing. The Mahayana tradition, which spread along the Silk Road, differs in significant ways from the Theravada tradition that spread through Southeast Asia by sea. Why did Buddhism spread so successfully along trade routes? Partly because its message of suffering and liberation appealed across cultures, partly because merchants needed the monastery networks for safe lodging and storage, Buddhist monasteries became banks, inns, and trading posts. The religion and commerce reinforced each other. Islam spread along the Silk Road in the centuries after Muhammad's death in 6032 CE. Arab and Persian Muslim merchants carried their faith east, establishing communities in Central Asian cities and eventually reaching China. The Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th to 10th centuries controlled much of the middle section of the Silk Road. Islamic civilization's golden age coincided with and was partly enabled by Silk Road trade. The wealth flowing through cities like Baghdad, Samarkand, and Bukhara funded libraries, observatories, hospitals, and madrasas. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded on Greek philosophy and science, which later flowed back to Europe and helped spark the Renaissance. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and geography all advanced significantly in the Islamic world, and these advances spread along the Silk Road. The Quran, like Buddhist sutras, was translated and carried along the trade routes. Islamic architecture, mosques, minarets, geometric decorations appeared in cities throughout Central Asia and Western China. Christianity also used the Silk Road, though less successfully. Nestorian Christianity, a branch considered heretical by Rome and Constantinople, spread from Persia into Central Asia and China. Nestorian churches existed in Chinese cities by the 7th century CE. The Nestorian stele, discovered in Shan, records the arrival of Nestorian missionaries in China in 635 CE. The text is in both Chinese and Syriac, evidence of cultural translation and adaptation. But Christianity never took deep root in China the way Buddhism did, though small communities persisted for centuries. Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism, and other religions also traveled the Silk Road, creating a remarkable religious diversity in Central Asian cities. Merchants needed to be multilingual and multi-religious, comfortable navigating different cultural contexts. Beyond religion, scientific and mathematical knowledge flowed along these roads. The concept of zero, essential for mathematics, originated in India and spread both west to Europe and east to China. Astronomical observations from Chinese, Indian, Persian, and Greek traditions were shared and compared. Medical knowledge traveled in all directions. Chinese acupuncture theory influenced Islamic medicine. Greek medical texts, translated into Arabic, were later translated into Latin and taught in European universities. Indian Ayurvedic medicine spread both east and west. Artistic styles blended. Greco-Buddhist art, combining Hellenistic and Indian traditions, emerged in Gandhara and spread along the Silk Road. Chinese artistic techniques influenced Persian miniature painting. Islamic geometric patterns appeared in Chinese ceramics. Music and musical instruments crossed borders. The pipa, a Chinese lute, descended from Persian and Central Asian instruments. Musical notation systems were shared and adapted. Even cuisine was transformed. Noodles may have traveled from China to Italy or vice versa. Historians debate. But certainly, cooking techniques, ingredients, and recipes flowed along the Silk Road, enriching every culture they touched. The Silk Road created a connected world of ideas long before globalization. It demonstrated that different civilizations could interact, trade, learn from each other without losing their distinct identities. It showed that cultural exchange, however difficult and imperfect, was possible and mutually beneficial. But the Silk Road wasn't all cultural exchange and profitable trade. It had a dark side, and we need to talk about it. Disease traveled the Silk Road as readily as silk. The most catastrophic was the bubonic plague, the Black Death. which killed somewhere between 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia in the 14th century. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, likely originated in Central Asia. It spread along trade routes, carried by fleas on rats that stowed away in caravans and ships. The disease reached China, India, the Middle East, and Europe, devastating populations everywhere. The Black Death killed perhaps a third of Europe's population. It depopulated entire regions, destroyed economies, caused social upheaval, and may have contributed to the end of the feudal system. The psychological impact was profound. Europeans' worldview was shaken by this incomprehensible catastrophe. But plague wasn't the only disease that traveled the Silk Road. Smallpox, measles, and other infectious diseases spread along these routes, with devastating effect on populations that had no immunity. The biological unification of Eurasia came at a terrible cost. Slavery was part of the Silk Road economy. Slaves were bought and sold in markets throughout the network. Conquered peoples, debtors, criminals, and kidnapped victims were all potential commodities. The Islamic world had extensive slave systems, and Silk Road trade supplied many of these slaves. Turkic peoples from the Central Asian steppes were often enslaved and sold southward. Later, the Mongol conquests generated millions of slaves. Some slaves were domestic servants, others soldiers. The Mamluks, who ruled Egypt, were originally slave soldiers. Others, laborers in mines or fields. The scale is hard to determine from historical records, but it was significant. Conflict was endemic along the Silk Road. Control of trade routes meant wealth and power, so cities, kingdoms, and empires constantly fought over them. The Xiongnu, the nomadic confederation that helped inspire the Silk Road's development, raided Chinese territories for centuries. The Han Dynasty spent enormous resources fighting them, building the Great Wall partly to restrict their access to settled regions. Later, various Turkic and Mongol groups controlled sections of the route, demanding tribute from merchants or simply raiding caravans. The Sogdians, an Iranian people, dominated Silk Road trade for centuries, partly because they could negotiate with these nomadic powers. Empires rose and fell based partly on their control of Silk Road trade. The Kushan Empire, the Sasanian Persian Empire, the Tang Dynasty, the night sleeping, praise, and bloodstains. A story of the leading priests to affect the planet's work could be defeated as being won. When the Mongols conquered most of Eurasia in the 13th century, they initially disrupted trade severely. Cities were destroyed, populations massacred. But then, ironically, the Mongol Empire created unprecedented peace along the Silk Road. The Pax Mongolica allowed safe passage from China to Europe under a single political system. Trade flourished as never before, but this too came at a cost. The Mongol conquests may have killed 10 to 40 million people, though estimates vary wildly. And the Pax Mongolica lasted less than a century before the Mongol Empire fragmented. Exploitation was built into the system. Middlemen took enormous profits, sometimes charging markups of several 100%. Local officials demanded bribes and taxes. Merchants cheated each other routinely, mixing inferior silk into good silk, substituting fake gems for real ones, short-weighing goods. Foreign merchants in Chinese cities faced discrimination and restrictions. Chinese merchants in Central Asian cities faced the same. Trust was hard to establish across cultural lines, so ethnic trading networks developed. Sogdians dominated certain routes, Armenians others, Jews in some regions, Arabs in others. The wealth generated by Silk Road trade was distributed very unevenly. A few merchants and rulers became fabulously rich. The laborers who actually transported the goods Camel drivers, porters, guards earned little. The farmers and artisans who produced the goods often received a fraction of what the final buyer paid. And there was environmental damage. Overgrazing by caravans animals damaged fragile desert and steppe ecosystems. Deforestation occurred near major cities. Water resources were depleted. Some oases dried up entirely, possibly due to overuse. The Silk Road, like all major economic systems, created winners and losers. It connected civilizations, but also spread death. It generated wealth, but also exploitation. It was a human creation, with all the ambiguity that implies. Understanding this complexity is crucial. The Silk Road wasn't a romantic adventure story or a simple tale of cultural exchange. It was a vast, complicated system that brought out both the best and worst of human nature, creativity and cruelty, curiosity and conquest, cooperation and conflict. The Silk Road didn't end suddenly. It declined gradually over several centuries due to a combination of political, economic, and technological factors. The Mongol Empire's fragmentation in the 14th century disrupted the Pax Mongolica. The unified political system that had made trade safe and relatively easy collapsed. Different Mongol successor states fought each other. Central Asia became more dangerous. The costs and risks of overland trade increased. The rise of maritime trade was perhaps the most important factor. Sea routes had always existed alongside land routes, but they became increasingly dominant. Ships could carry more cargo than caravans. Maritime trade was faster. A voyage from China to the Middle East by sea took weeks, while the overland journey took months or years. The development of better ships and navigation techniques made sea trade safer. The magnetic compass, which originated in China, revolutionized maritime navigation. Astronomical navigation techniques improved. Insurance systems developed to spread risk. By the 15th century, the maritime route from China through Southeast Asia, around India, and through the Arabian Sea carried more trade than the overland Silk Road. Chinese Admiral Zheng He, whose voyages in the early 15th century demonstrated the potential of sea power, though China then turned inward and abandoned large-scale maritime exploration. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 is often cited as ending the Silk Road, though this is oversimplified. The Ottomans did control much of the Western Silk Road, and they did tax trade heavily. But trade continued, just less profitably for European merchants. What the Ottoman control did do was motivate Europeans to seek alternative routes to Asian goods. This led directly to the Age of Exploration. Portuguese exploration of the African coast, Vasco da Gama's voyage to India around Africa, and eventually Columbus's attempt to reach Asia by sailing west, all were motivated by the desire to bypass Ottoman and Mamluk control of Eastern trade. Political instability in Central Asia made overland trade increasingly risky. Various Timurid successor states fought over the remains of Timur's empire. Local warlords raided trade routes. The costs of security, tribute, and bribes made trade less profitable. The Ming dynasty's inward turn reduced Chinese engagement with the Silk Road. After the expansive voyages of Zheng He, the Ming government decided to focus on internal affairs and border defense rather than maritime or overland trade. They restricted foreign trade, requiring it to go through official tribute missions. This didn't stop trade entirely, but it reduced official support. Without Chinese demand driving trade, the eastern end of the Silk Road withered. Climate change may have played a role. The 14th century saw cooling temperatures and increased aridity in Central Asia. Some oases became less reliable. Grazing land for caravan animals deteriorated. the region could support less trade. The shift in European trade routes completed the Silk Road's decline. Once Portuguese and later Dutch and English merchants established direct sea routes to Asia, European demand for goods via the Silk Road collapsed. Why pay Ottoman middlemen when you could trade directly with Indian or Chinese merchants? By the 17th century, the Silk Road as a major trade network was essentially dead. Some local trade continued, but the transcontinental caravans, the great movements of silk and spices that had defined Eurasian commerce for over a millennium, had ended. The cities that had thrived on Silk Road trade declined or were abandoned. Samarkand, Merv, Kashgar, they persisted, but as shadows of their former glory. The caravanserais fell into ruin. The wells and rest stops were forgotten. Sand buried the roads. The Silk Road passed into history, remembered dimly, if at all, until scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries began piecing together its story from archaeology, ancient texts, and the ruins scattered across Central Asia. The Silk Road's end didn't erase its impact. It fundamentally shaped the development of Eurasian civilizations in ways that persist to this day. Economic legacy. The Silk Road pioneered many commercial practices we still use. Letters of credit, allowing merchants to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another without physically transporting it, were developed on the Silk Road. Insurance, spreading risk among multiple investors, emerged from Silk Road trade. International commercial law, establishing common rules for merchants from different cultures, has roots in Silk Road practices. The Silk Road also demonstrated the power of free trade. Despite political divisions, despite cultural differences, despite wars and conflicts, trade continued because it benefited everyone involved. This lesson, that mutual economic benefit can transcend other divisions, remains relevant. Cultural legacy, the blending of cultures along the Silk Road, created art, music, literature, and cuisine that still influence us. The cuisines of Central Asia, mixing Chinese, Persian, Indian, and Turkic elements, are direct Silk Road descendants. Uzbek plov, Uyghur lagman, and countless other dishes are living remnants of Silk Road cultural exchange. Artistic traditions show Silk Road influence. Islamic geometric patterns influenced Chinese decorative arts. Chinese landscape painting techniques influenced Persian miniatures. The transmission of Buddhist art from India to China created entirely new artistic traditions. Religious legacy. Buddhism might never have spread beyond India without the Silk Road. Today, Buddhism is practiced by hundreds of millions of people in East and Southeast Asia. Zen meditation, practiced worldwide, descends from Chan Buddhism, which emerged from Silk Road cultural exchange. Islam spread into Central Asia and Western China, created Muslim communities that persist today. The Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other Central Asian peoples are predominantly Muslim due to Silk Road-era conversions. Technological legacy. Technologies that traveled the Silk Road transformed the world. Paper and printing revolutionized knowledge transmission. Gunpowder changed warfare. The compass enabled maritime exploration. Mathematical concepts like zero transformed science and mathematics. These technologies didn't just spread, they were improved and adapted by each culture they reached. Chinese gunpowder became Ottoman cannons, became European artillery. Indian mathematics combined with Greek geometry to create Arabic algebra. This cumulative cross-cultural technological development continues today. Political legacy. The Silk Road demonstrated that diverse cultures could coexist and cooperate. The cosmopolitan trading cities, where people of different religions, languages, and ethnicities worked together, were remarkable for their time. They showed that tolerance and pluralism could be economically beneficial. They also showed the limits of this tolerance. When political conditions worsened, when resources became scarce, cosmopolitan cooperation often broke down. The lesson is complex. Exchange and cooperation are possible, but fragile, requiring constant maintenance. Geographical legacy. The Silk Road opened up Central Asia to the wider world. Before the Silk Road, this region was largely unknown to settled civilizations in China, India, and the Mediterranean. The Silk Road mapped it, developed it, connected it. Modern Central Asian nations, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, still show Silk Road influences in their cultures, architecture, and place in regional trade networks. The cities that thrived on Silk Road trade remain important regional centers. Modern relevance. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, is explicitly modeled on the Silk Road. It aims to create new trade routes linking Asia, Europe, and Africa through infrastructure investment. Whether it will succeed is debatable, but the choice to reference the modern relevance, China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, is explicitly modeled on the Silk Road. It aims to create new trade routes linking Asia, Europe, and Africa through infrastructure investment. Whether it will succeed is debatable, but the choice to reference the historical Silk Road shows its enduring power as a symbol of connection and prosperity. The initiative has built ports, railways, highways, and pipelines across dozens of countries. Critics point to debt burdens placed on participating nations, environmental concerns, and geopolitical implications. Supporters argue it's bringing needed infrastructure to developing regions and creating new economic opportunities. But the parallel to the historical Silk Road is imperfect. The ancient Silk Road emerged organically from merchant initiative and local rulers' pragmatic decisions. The Belt and Road Initiative is a centrally planned state project. The ancient route connected roughly equal civilizations, trading goods they each needed. The modern version often involves a wealthy China investing in poorer nations in exchange for political influence and access to resources. Still, the fact that this massive geopolitical initiative takes its name and inspiration from the Silk Road shows how deeply that ancient trade network has penetrated our collective imagination. It represents an ideal of peaceful exchange, mutual benefit, and cultural dialogue, even if the reality was always more complicated. Archaeological legacy. The Silk Road continues to yield discoveries. Archaeologists working in Central Asia regularly uncover new sites, artifacts, and information. The deserts that made travel so difficult had also preserved ruins remarkably well. Entire cities, buried by sand, are being excavated. In 2014, UNESCO designated a section of the Silk Road as a World Heritage Site, recognizing 33 sites across China, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. This has spurred both archaeological work and tourism. People want to walk where the ancient caravans walked, to see the oasis cities and mountain passes, to connect with this history. Recent discoveries have challenged and refined our understanding. DNA analysis of mummies found in the Taklamakan Desert has revealed unexpected migration patterns and ethnic mixing. Analysis of ancient trade goods has shown more complex trade networks than previously thought. Climate science has helped explain why certain oases thrived or failed. Educational legacy. The Silk Road has become central to how we teach world history. It's a perfect case study for demonstrating that civilizations didn't develop in isolation. It shows that globalization isn't new, that humans have been connecting across vast distances for millennia. It also complicates simplistic narratives. Students learning about the Silk Road must grapple with how trade and cultural exchange occurred alongside war, disease, and exploitation. They must understand that different civilizations can be technologically advanced in different ways. Rome had better concrete and road building. China had better silk production and ceramics. India had more advanced mathematics. The Silk Road teaches that history isn't just about great men and battles. It's about merchants, monks, translators, camel drivers, ordinary people making extraordinary journeys. It's about how economic incentives can drive cultural exchange. It's about the unintended consequences of human actions, how a trade route opened for silk ended up transforming religions, spreading diseases, and reshaping civilizations. Let's narrow our focus now and try to understand what life was actually like for the people who made the Silk Road function, the merchants themselves. These weren't romantic adventurers or noble explorers. They were businessmen, and yes, almost always men, trying to make a profit, support their families, and hopefully survive the journey. Let's reconstruct what their lives might have been like. Family and background. Most Silk Road merchants came from merchant families. This wasn't a career you stumbled into. It required capital, connections, knowledge, and languages, things passed down through generations. A merchant house might have branches in multiple cities, with sons and brothers stationed along the route. Some ethnic groups specialized in Silk Road trade. The Sogdians, an Iranian people from Central Asia, dominated much of the trade for centuries. They were multilingual, maintained far-flung networks, and had reputations as honest brokers, crucial in a business built on trust. Armenian merchants operated similar networks. So did Jewish merchants in some regions, and later Arab and Persian Muslim merchants. These merchant communities often formed diasporas, with members living in foreign cities but maintaining their language, religion, and commercial ties. They married within the community, ensuring wealth stayed in the family and commercial knowledge was preserved. Training. A young merchant would begin learning the trade as a child. He'd learn languages. A successful Silk Road merchant might speak Chinese, Persian, Sogdian, and several other languages. He'd learn currencies, weights and measures, which varied from region to region. He'd learn how to evaluate goods, how to tell quality silk from inferior silk, real jade from fake, fresh spices from old. He'd learn geography and route conditions, which oases were reliable, which passes were open, in which seasons, where were the bandits most active. This knowledge could mean the difference between profit and loss, survival and death. He'd learn negotiation, both commercial and diplomatic, how to haggle in a bazaar, how to bribe a border official without insulting him, how to navigate different cultural expectations around contracts and promises. And he'd learn practical skills, how to care for camels, how to navigate by stars, how to find water in the desert, how to defend a caravan against raiders. Capital and organization. Mounting a caravan required substantial capital. Goods to trade, animals to carry them, provisions for the journey, guards for protection. All of this was expensive. Most merchants couldn't finance a trip alone. Partnerships were common. Multiple merchants would pool resources, sharing both costs and profits. Sometimes silent partners would invest capital in exchange for a share of profits without making the journey themselves. This spread risk. If a caravan was lost, no single merchant was ruined. Credit was crucial. A merchant might buy goods on credit in one city, transport them, sell them in another city, and use the profits to pay back the original loan. This required trust and reputation. A merchant who defaulted on debts would find himself unable to do business anywhere along the route. Word traveled fast in merchant networks. The journey. Let's follow a hypothetical merchant. Call him Hassan, on a journey from Samarkand to Chang'an. Hassan has bought a load of glass vessels and Persian carpets in Samarkand. He's joined a caravan of about 50 camels, organized by a caravan leader who knows the route well. There are a dozen other merchants, plus guards, camel drivers, cooks, and servants. About 30 men in total. They leave Samarkand in early spring, the best time for travel. Summer heat makes the desert crossing brutal. Winter cold makes the mountain passes impassable. Spring offers moderate temperatures and the oases are well watered from winter snowmelt. The first leg takes them east through relatively easy terrain. They travel about 20 to 25 miles per day, stopping at villages and small oases. Hassan has been this way before and knows several local merchants. He stays in their homes, shares meals, exchanges information about route conditions ahead. After 2 weeks, they reach Kashgar. This is a major stop. Hassan rests for a week, sells some of his goods at Kashgar's famous market, buys some Chinese goods being sold westward, paper, tea, some porcelain. He's looking for arbitrage opportunities, goods that are cheap here but will be valuable further along the route. In Kashgar, he also hears disturbing news. There's been trouble on the northern route. Bandits have raided several caravans. The southern route is safer but longer. The caravan leader decides on a middle route through the northern edge of the Taklamakan, but not the main northern route. This is where things get serious. Water is available only at specific oases, spaced several days apart. The caravan travels early morning and evening, resting during the midday heat. At night, temperatures drop dramatically. Hassan sleeps in a tent, wrapped in blankets. The monotony is oppressive. The same scenery, day after day, sand and rocks and distant mountains. The caravan's camels plod along, bells jingling. The men walk mostly in silence, conserving energy. Hassan prays 5 times daily, facing Mecca as best he can determine. One night, scouts spot a group of riders in the distance. The caravan bunches together defensively. The guards ready their weapons. But the riders don't attack. They're another caravan, heading west. The two groups camp together that night, sharing a fire. Hassan talks with merchants heading back from China. They give him information about prices in Chinese cities, which routes are open, which officials are demanding the highest bribes. This information is valuable. Hassan adjusts his plans based on what he learns. He'll sell his glass in Dunhuang rather than Chang'an. Prices are good there, and he can buy silk cheaper, closer to its source. They reach Dunhuang after 5 weeks of travel. Hassan is exhausted, sunburned, and has lost weight despite adequate food. But he's alive, and his goods are intact. He finds lodging at a Buddhist monastery that caters to merchants. The monks provide safe storage and act as informal bankers. Hassan spends 2 months in Dunhuang. This isn't lost time. He's negotiating deals, evaluating silk quality, waiting for silk shipments to arrive from Chang'an, and gathering information. He visits the famous mobile caves, prays at the local mosque, and socializes with other merchants. Eventually, he's ready to return. He's bought silk, some porcelain, and tea. The silk especially will bring enormous profits in Samarkand if he can get it there safely. He joins a westbound caravan and begins the long journey home. Total travel time, about 10 months round trip. In that time, Hassan has crossed deserts, negotiated with dozens of people, survived sandstorms and extreme temperatures, prayed in both mosques and Buddhist temples, learned about Chinese politics and Persian wars, and hopefully made enough profit to support his family for several years. Risks and rewards. The profit margins were enormous if you succeeded. A merchant who made 3 successful round trips in his lifetime could retire wealthy. But the risks were equally enormous. Death was common. Bandits, disease, accidents, extreme weather, any could kill you. Some merchants were murdered for their goods. Others died of dehydration when water sources dried up. Still others succumbed to plague or other diseases contracted in crowded cities. Financial ruin was also possible. Goods could be stolen or lost. Prices might collapse if too many merchants brought the same goods to the same city at once. Wars could close routes, stranding merchants with goods they couldn't sell. Corrupt officials could confiscate goods on trumped-up charges, yet they kept coming. The potential rewards outweighed the risks, at least in the minds of ambitious young men. For every merchant who died or was ruined, another took his place. The flow of goods never stopped for long. Social status: merchants occupied an ambiguous social position. They were often wealthy, sometimes extremely so. But many cultures looked down on commerce as less honorable than farming, scholarship, or military service. In China, Confucian ideology placed merchants at the bottom of the social hierarchy, below scholars, farmers, and artisans. In practice, wealthy merchants could buy influence and respect, but they could never completely escape the stigma of their profession. In the Islamic world, merchants had higher status. Muhammad himself had been a merchant, and Islamic law gave detailed regulations for commercial transactions, implying commerce was a legitimate and important activity. But everywhere, merchants were somewhat suspect. They were outsiders, foreigners, people who crossed boundaries. They had wealth, but not necessarily the family lineage or education that traditionally brought respect. They were necessary, but not quite reputable. Religion and identity. Religion mattered enormously on the Silk Road. It provided community, trust networks, and practical support. Merchants often preferred doing business with co-religionists who shared their values and could be held accountable through religious authorities. Buddhist monasteries provided lodging and banking services to traveling merchants. Islamic waqfs, charitable endowments, built caravanserais, providing free or cheap lodging to Muslim travelers. Christian and Jewish merchants had their own networks and support systems. But merchants also had to be pragmatic. Hassan, our Muslim merchant, would stay in Buddhist monasteries if necessary. He'd hire Christian translators, do business with Zoroastrian traders, and pay respects to local deities to appease superstitious caravan drivers. This constant cultural negotiation was exhausting, but necessary. Successful merchants became cultural translators, able to navigate multiple worlds. They learned when to insist on their own religious practices and when to accommodate local customs. Legacy and memory. Most merchants left no written record. We know them only through fragments, contracts, letters, account books discovered in caves or ruins. Archaeological finds like the Dunhuang manuscripts give us glimpses of their lives, but most died unknown and forgotten. Yet collectively, they built the Silk Road. Without their ambition, courage, and commercial acumen, goods and ideas wouldn't have flowed between civilizations. They were the essential infrastructure, more important than roads or caravanserai. They took the risks, made the journeys, bridged the cultural gaps. We romanticize them now, imagining adventurous traders crossing exotic landscapes. The reality was grittier, sweaty, dusty, dangerous work motivated by profit. But in pursuing profit, they created something larger than themselves. They connected the world. We can't understand the Silk Road without understanding the animals that made it possible. The route's existence depended on animals capable of surviving harsh conditions while carrying heavy loads across enormous distances. The Bactrian camel, this was the Silk Road's workhorse, or more accurately, work camel. The two-humped Bactrian camel, as opposed to the one-humped dromedary of Arabia, was perfectly adapted to Silk Road conditions. These camels can carry 400 to 500 pounds of goods, travel 25 to 30 miles per day, and go up to 2 weeks without water by drawing on fat reserves stored in their humps. They can tolerate temperatures from 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer to -20 degrees Fahrenheit in winter. Their wide, tough hooves spread their weight, preventing them from sinking into sand. Their thick fur protects against both heat and cold. Their long eyelashes and sealable nostrils protect against sandstorms. A typical Silk Road caravan might have 50 to 100 camels, though some were much larger. The animals were expensive. A good camel might cost as much as several slaves, but essential. Merchants who couldn't afford camels had to hire them, cutting into profits. Camels are also stubborn, smelly, and prone to spitting when annoyed. Camel drivers needed skill and patience. They had to know how to load cargo properly, how to find grazing and water, how to treat common ailments. A sick camel could slow an entire caravan. A dead camel meant redistributing its load, further slowing progress. But despite their difficulties, camels made the Silk Road possible. Without them, crossing the Central Asian deserts would have been impossible for laden caravans. Horses. While camels carried goods, horses carried people and served military purposes. But not just any horses. The Silk Road drove demand for specific, superior breeds. Chinese emperors were obsessed with the heavenly horses of Fergana in modern Uzbekistan. These horses were larger, stronger, and faster than native Chinese breeds. They could carry armored cavalry, crucial for military dominance. Chinese sources describe them as blood-sweating horses. Nix, probably a poetic description of their sweat, which appeared red, possibly due to a skin parasite. The Han Dynasty traded enormous quantities of silk for these horses. Emperor Wu sent multiple military expeditions to Fergana to secure access to these animals. The Chinese army's effectiveness depended on quality cavalry horses, making them a strategic resource. Arab horses, renowned for speed and endurance, were also highly valued. They spread throughout the Silk Road regions, crossbreeding with local horses and improving stocks everywhere. Horses required more care than camels. They needed water daily, regular feeding, and were more vulnerable to disease and harsh conditions. But for military purposes, for rapid communication, and for wealthy travelers, they were essential. Donkeys and mules. These less glamorous animals did crucial work. Donkeys were smaller, cheaper, and more sure-footed than horses or camels, making them ideal for mountain trails. Mules, horse-donkey hybrids, combined the best qualities of both parents, stronger than donkeys, more sure-footed than horses. In mountainous regions like the Pamirs, where the Silk Road crossed some of the world's highest passes, mules and donkeys were often more reliable than camels. They could navigate narrow mountain trails that would be impossible for loaded camels. Yaks. In the highest mountains, particularly in Tibet, yaks were essential. These long-haired bovines thrive at high altitudes where other animals struggle. They can carry loads, provide milk and meat, and their fur can be woven into fabric. Tibetan traders used yak caravans to transport goods across the Himalayan passes. Dogs, guard dogs, protected caravans from wolves and warned of approaching bandits. Large, aggressive breeds like Tibetan Mastiffs were particularly valued. These dogs could bring down wolves, and their barking alerted caravans to danger in time to prepare defenses. The economics of animals. Managing animals was a major part of caravan logistics and expenses. Feed and water for dozens of animals had to be planned carefully. Too little, and animals weakened or died. Too much, and the caravan moved too slowly or couldn't carry enough trade goods. Veterinary care was crucial. Caravan leaders employed specialists who understood animal medicine, could treat common ailments, and knew when an animal needed to be abandoned rather than slow the entire caravan. Animals also served as currency. In regions where coin money was scarce or not trusted, animals might be traded directly for goods or services. A merchant might pay an official's tax with a camel or settle a debt with several horses. The human-animal relationship. Silk Road travelers developed close relationships with their animals, especially the camels they worked with for months. Camels were given names, and their personalities and quirks became familiar. Experienced camel drivers could read their animals, recognizing signs of illness, thirst, or distress before serious problems developed. But the relationship was ultimately utilitarian. Animals that couldn't keep pace were abandoned in the desert to die. Animals that became ill or injured were slaughtered for meat rather than burden the caravan. Sentimentality was a luxury caravans couldn't afford. Environmental impact, the constant passage of thousands of animals over centuries, affected the landscape. Grazing degraded vegetation near oases and along common routes. Water sources were depleted. Some areas that were once viable grazing lands became desertified, possibly contributing to the abandonment of some Silk Road routes. Ancient sources occasionally mention environmental problems. An oasis might become unreliable not just because climate changed, but because too many caravans had overused its resources. This created feedback loops. As certain routes became less viable, caravans concentrated on alternative routes, accelerating environmental degradation there. Modern descendants. Today, Bactrian camels are endangered in the wild, with fewer than 1,000 surviving in remote parts of Mongolia and China. The domestic Bactrian camel population is much larger, but even domestic camels are less common than they once were, replaced by trucks and trains for cargo transport. Some of the horse breeds developed along the Silk Road still exist. The Fergana horse's descendants are bred in Turkmenistan, where they're considered a national treasure. The Przhalski's horse, a wild breed from the Mongolian steppes, nearly went extinct, but has been saved through captive breeding and reintroduction programs. These animals are living links to the Silk Road's past, reminders that the route's existence depended not just on human ambition and ingenuity, but on the remarkable animals that could survive the journey. Imagine standing in a market in Samarkand in the year 500 CE. Around you, you'd hear Chinese, Sogdian, Persian, Sanskrit, Tocharian, Turkic languages, maybe some Greek from traders connected to Byzantium. The Silk Road was one of the most multilingual places in human history. Linguistic diversity. Dozens of languages were spoken along the Silk Road from multiple language families. Sino-Tibetan languages, Chinese, various dialects, Tibetan, Indo-European languages, Persian, Sogdian, Bactrian, Sanskrit, Tocharian, Greek, various Iranian languages, Altaic languages, Mongolian, Semitic languages, Mongolian, Semitic languages, Arabic, Syriac, used by Nestorian Christians, unisolated languages, Korean, Japanese, at the eastern terminus. This diversity created enormous practical challenges. How do merchants from China negotiate with merchants from Persia when they share no common language? Lingua francas. Several languages served as lingua francas, common languages that people from different regions could use to communicate. Sogdian was the primary Silk Road lingua franca for centuries. The Sogdians, based in cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, were the intermediaries of Silk Road trade. Sogdian became the language of commerce from China to Central Asia. Sogdian merchants had communities in Chinese cities, and Chinese merchants learned at least basic Sogdian. Sogdian was an Eastern Iranian language, written in a script derived from Aramaic. It's now extinct, but we have many Sogdian documents, commercial contracts, letters, Buddhist texts, from archaeological finds like the Dunhuang manuscripts. Persians served a similar role in the western half of the Silk Road. Various forms of Persian were spoken across a huge area, from Persia itself through Afghanistan and into Central Asia. Persian was the administrative language of several empires that controlled Silk Road territories. Arabic became increasingly important after the Islamic conquests. By the 9th century, Arabic was the lingua franca of trade from Central Asia through the Middle East. Islamic merchants from different regions used Arabic to communicate, supplemented by local languages. Classical Chinese served as the lingua franca in East Asia. Merchants and officials from Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and even Central Asia learned classical Chinese to interact with Chinese authorities. The translator's role, given this linguistic complexity, translators were essential. Professional translators worked in trading cities, facilitating negotiations between merchants who couldn't understand each other. Translators needed more than linguistic skill. They needed cultural knowledge, understanding customs, business practices, and unspoken assumptions that varied by culture. A literal translation might convey words, but miss meaning if the translator didn't understand context. The reliability and honesty of translators was crucial. A dishonest translator could cheat both parties, pocketing the difference. A lazy or incompetent translator could cause misunderstandings that ended negotiations. Consequently, good translators were highly valued and well paid. Some merchant families made translation their specialty, passing language skills through generations. Jewish merchants, scattered across multiple regions, often spoke several languages and served as translators. The Sogdians similarly produced many multilingual individuals. Translation bureaus. Major trading cities had formal translation bureaus. In Chinese cities, the government maintained offices where official documents could be translated for foreign merchants. Buddhist monasteries often had translation bureaus, where monks translated religious texts from Sanskrit into Chinese, Tibetan, or other languages. These translation efforts weren't just practical, they were intellectual achievements. Translating Buddhist concepts from Sanskrit into Chinese required creating new vocabulary and philosophical frameworks. Chinese had no existing words for many Buddhist ideas, so translators either borrowed Sanskrit terms, creating loanwords, or coined new Chinese compounds. This translation work shaped the development of Buddhism in China. Different translation choices led to different interpretations of Buddhist doctrine, contributing to the emergence of distinct Chinese Buddhist schools. Multilingualism as survival. For merchants, learning multiple languages wasn't optional. It was essential for survival and success. A merchant who spoke only his native language was at the mercy of translators and easily cheated. A merchant who spoke several languages could negotiate directly, verify what translators told him, and access more opportunities. Consequently, Silk Road merchants were often impressively multilingual. A successful merchant might speak 4 or 5 languages, with varying degrees of fluency. Children of merchant families grew up hearing multiple languages and absorbed them naturally. This multilingualism wasn't limited to merchants. Camel drivers, guides, innkeepers, officials, anyone who dealt regularly with foreigners needed at least rudimentary language skills. Border regions, where different linguistic zones met, produced particularly multilingual populations. Written communication. Silk Road trade also required written records, contracts, letters of credit, cargo manifests, correspondence between merchants in different cities. This created demand for literacy in multiple scripts. Various writing systems were used: Chinese characters for Chinese, various alphabetic scripts for Iranian languages, Sogdian, Persian, Bactrian, Arabic script for Arabic and Persian after Islamization, various scripts for Indian languages, Brahmi, Devanagari, runic scripts for Turkic languages, Mongol script derived from Uyghur script, itself derived from Sogdian script. Merchants needed to be able to read contracts and documents in multiple scripts, or employ scribes who could. This created a class of professional scribes, often associated with merchant communities or religious institutions. Pidgins and creoles, in places where people from many linguistic backgrounds interacted regularly, simplified languages emerged. These pidgins, simplified languages combining elements from multiple source languages, facilitated basic communication. We have limited evidence for Silk Road pidgins, but they almost certainly existed. Markets where dozens of languages were spoken daily would naturally develop simplified communication methods. Some loanwords in Central Asian languages suggest contact-induced simplification and borrowing. Language extinction and preservation. The Silk Road's decline led to the extinction of several languages. Sogdian, once the lingua franca of Central Asia, died out as Islamic conquests spread Arabic and Persian. Tocharian languages, spoken in the Tarim Basin, vanished without descendants. Ironically, the same trade routes that spread these languages also preserved them. Merchants and monks carried manuscripts across vast distances. When these manuscripts were sealed in caves like at Dunhuang or buried with the dead in deserts, they preserved languages that would otherwise be lost to history. Modern linguists studying Silk Road languages work from these preserved texts. The Sogdian language was barely known until archaeological discoveries in Central Asia and China revealed thousands of Sogdian documents. Tatarian was completely unknown until early 20th century discoveries in Western China. Cultural implications. The linguistic diversity of the Silk Road forced pragmatism. People couldn't afford strong prejudices about language purity or superiority. Commerce required communication, whatever form that took. This created relatively tolerant attitudes, at least in trading contexts. But linguistic diversity also created barriers and misunderstandings. Jokes didn't translate. Subtle negotiations were difficult. Deep friendships across language barriers were rare. The Silk Road connected civilizations, but linguistic differences reminded everyone that they remained distinct. The echo of this linguistic complexity remains in modern Central Asia, where multilingualism is still common, where Russian, Chinese, Turkic languages, Persian, and Arabic all have spheres of influence. The region's languages still bear traces of their Silk Road past, loanwords, grammatical influences, shared vocabulary that crossed linguistic boundaries centuries ago, when camels, not trucks, carried trade goods across the steppes and deserts. The Silk Road's most visible legacy is its art. Wherever trade routes passed, artistic styles met, mixed, and created something new. Understanding Silk Road art means understanding cultural exchange made tangible. Greco-Buddhist art. This is perhaps the clearest example of Silk Road artistic fusion. In Gandhara, modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and surrounding regions, Greek artistic traditions brought by Alexander the Great's conquests met Indian Buddhist iconography. The result was remarkable. Buddha, who in early Indian art was represented symbolically by footprints, an empty throne, a wheel, was for the first time depicted in human form, but in the style of Greek sculpture. These Buddhas have idealized Greek features, wear toga-like robes with realistic drapery, and stand in classical contrapposto pose. Greco-Buddhist art then spread along the Silk Road. As it moved east, it evolved. Chinese artists adapted these Greco-Buddhist forms to their own aesthetic preferences. The realistic drapery became more stylized. The Greek features softened to appear more Chinese. By the time Buddhist art reached Japan, centuries of artistic evolution had transformed the Greek-influenced originals into something distinctly East Asian, but traces of the Greek origins remained. The standing Buddha pose, the arrangement of robes, certain iconographic elements, these preserved memories of their Mediterranean origins even in Chinese and Japanese Buddhist art. The Mogao Caves. The Mogao Caves near Dunhuang are an artistic time capsule. Created over 1,000 years from the 4th to 14th century CE, the cave's murals and sculptures show the evolution of Silk Road art. Early caves show strong Indian and Central Asian influences. The Buddhas have Indian features. The compositions follow Indian conventions. Middle period caves show increasing Chinese influence, more landscape elements, different color palettes, Chinese artistic techniques. Late period caves are essentially Chinese art with Buddhist subjects. But throughout, we see foreign elements. A ceiling might use Persian geometric patterns. A mural might include a merchant figure in clearly Roman dress. Another might show musicians with instruments from half a dozen cultures. The Mogao Caves aren't just Buddhist art. They're a visual encyclopedia of Silk Road culture. The murals depict daily life, showing us what caravans looked like, what goods they carried, how people dressed. They show us the multicultural reality of Silk Road cities. Textile arts. Silk itself was a canvas for artistic exchange. Chinese silk often featured Chinese motifs, dragons, phoenixes, cloud patterns, but silk produced for export sometimes incorporated foreign design elements. Archaeological finds have revealed Chinese silk with Persian floral patterns, Central Asian silk with Chinese character patterns, Indian cotton with Chinese-influenced designs. Textile production responded to market demands, and different markets wanted different designs. The Silk Road also spread dyeing techniques, weaving methods, and embroidery styles. Chinese silk weaving technology was eventually copied in Byzantium and elsewhere. Persian carpet weaving influenced textile production in China and Central Asia. Ceramics. Chinese porcelain was exported west along the Silk Road, and its forms influenced pottery across Asia and eventually Europe. But influence went both ways. Chinese potters created pieces specifically for export markets, incorporating shapes and decorative elements that appealed to foreign buyers. Islamic ceramics influenced Chinese design. Cobalt blue decoration, which became iconic in Chinese blue and white porcelain, came from Islamic pottery traditions. Persian and Central Asian potters learned Chinese techniques and adapted them to their own aesthetic traditions. Metalwork. The Silk Road spread metallurgical techniques and artistic styles. Chinese bronze working, Persian gold and silver working, Central Asian iron working all influenced each other. Archaeological sites have yielded bronze mirrors with mixed Chinese-Persian designs, silver vessels combining Central Asian shapes with Chinese decorative motifs, weapons incorporating technological innovations from multiple traditions. Architecture. Silk Road cities show architectural fusion. A mosque might incorporate Chinese building techniques. A Chinese Buddhist temple might use Central Asian decorative elements. City layouts combine defensive features from multiple military traditions. The architecture of Central Asian cities like Samarkand and Bukhara combined Persian, Islamic, Mongol, and Chinese influences. The famous Registan in Samarkand, with its 3 massive madrasas covered in geometric tiles, represents centuries of architectural evolution along Silk Road routes. Manuscript elimination. As religious texts and literary works traveled the Silk Road, so did illustration styles. Persian miniature painting influenced Chinese painting. Chinese landscape techniques appeared in Central Asian manuscripts. Islamic geometric patterns decorated Buddhist manuscripts. The Dunhuang manuscripts include texts in multiple languages, illustrated in styles from multiple traditions. A single manuscript might combine Chinese calligraphy, Central Asian decorative borders, and Indian-influenced illustrations. Musical instruments. The Silk Road spread musical instruments and musical traditions. The pipa, a Chinese lute, descended from Persian and Central Asian instruments. The erhu, a Chinese bowed instrument, may have Central Asian origins. Instruments traveled along trade routes, were adapted to local musical traditions, and eventually became integral to their adopted cultures. Dance and performance. Though harder to document than physical art objects, dance and theatrical traditions also spread along the Silk Road. Chinese sources mention foreign dancers performing in Tang Dynasty courts. Central Asian acrobatic traditions influenced Chinese performance arts. Indian dance influenced Southeast Asian traditions, which in turn influenced Chinese dance. Artistic patronage. Silk Road trade created wealth, and wealth funded art. Successful merchants commissioned artworks for temples, mosques, churches. They built caravanserais decorated with murals. They funded manuscript production. They bought luxury goods that stimulated artistic production. Buddhist monasteries, Islamic madrasas, Nestorian churches all received donations from merchants grateful for divine protection during dangerous journeys. This religious patronage funded immense artistic production. Modern appreciation. Today's Silk Road art is studied, preserved, and celebrated. Museums worldwide hold Silk Road artifacts. The Mughal Caves are a UNESCO World Heritage Site and major tourist destination. Academic fields study Greco-Buddhist art, Central Asian Islamic art, and the artistic exchanges of the Silk Road period. This artistic legacy demonstrates something profound. Cultural exchange, even driven primarily by commerce, creates beauty. The meeting of different traditions sparks creativity. Artists exposed to foreign styles don't just copy them, they adapt, combine, and innovate, creating works that belong to multiple traditions yet are unique. The Silk Road's art reminds us that civilization doesn't develop in isolation. Every artistic tradition we admire contains influences from elsewhere, techniques learned from foreigners, aesthetic sensibilities shaped by cultural contact. The Silk Road made this visible, leaving us artworks that are simultaneously Chinese and Persian, Greek and Indian, universal and particular. We've traveled from Chang'an to Constantinople, crossed deserts where water was worth gold, climbed mountains where the air was too thin to breathe, stopped in cities where a dozen languages filled the marketplaces, and watched as silk, spices, ideas, and religions flowed across a continent. What does it all mean? What can we learn from this ancient trade route that might matter for us today? First, connection is possible but difficult. The Silk Road existed for over 1,000 years, but it was never easy. Every journey was dangerous. Every transaction required trust across cultural lines. Every exchange involved risks. Yet it happened. People found ways to cooperate, despite speaking different languages, following different religions, coming from different civilizations. This should give us both hope and humility. Hope, because if people could maintain connections across Eurasia using camels and foot power, surely we can maintain connections using modern technology. Humility, because even with all our advantages, connections still requires work, understanding, and mutual benefit. Second, exchange is multi-directional. The Silk Road wasn't about one superior civilization enlightening inferior ones. Chinese technology flowed west. Indian mathematics and philosophy flowed both east and west. Persian and Central Asian goods and ideas flowed east. Greek artistic traditions flowed east via Bactria and Gandhara. Every civilization contributed. Every civilization learned. The idea that human progress has a single center or direction is contradicted by Silk Road history. Innovation happened everywhere, and the societies most open to foreign ideas often prospered most. Third, trade creates unexpected consequences. The merchants traveling the Silk Road sought profit. They weren't trying to spread Buddhism, transform artistic traditions, or enable the scientific revolution. But their commercial activities had cultural, religious, technological, and political consequences far beyond their intentions. Economic motives aren't the whole story of human behavior, but they're a powerful force. The Silk Road shows how market incentives, pursuing individual profit, can accidentally create public goods like cultural exchange and technological advancement. But it also shows the dark side. Those same trade networks spread disease, enabled slavery, and sometimes intensified conflicts. Unintended consequences cut both ways. Fourth, infrastructure matters. The Silk Road wasn't just merchants and camels. It was caravanserais providing lodging, wells providing water, guides providing knowledge of routes, banking systems enabling credit, legal frameworks enabling contracts. All of this infrastructure had to be built and maintained. When political conditions deteriorated, when wars disrupted trade, when infrastructure wasn't maintained, the Silk Road suffered or ceased functioning. Connection requires investment, security, and stable institutions. Fifth, cultural identity can coexist with exchange. The Silk Road didn't homogenize cultures. Chinese remained distinctly Chinese, despite centuries of exposure to Indian Buddhism and Central Asian goods. Persians remained distinctly Persian, despite Chinese silk and Indian spices. Cultures absorbed foreign influences, but maintained their core identities. This contradicts both those who fear that cultural exchange destroys distinct identities and those who imagine exchange creates universal similarity. The reality is messier. Cultures borrow from each other constantly, but remain distinct, synthesizing foreign influences with local traditions to create something both familiar and new. Sixth, peace and prosperity are linked. The Silk Road flourished during periods of peace and declined during periods of warfare. The Pax Mongolica, despite the horror of Mongol conquests, created conditions for unprecedented trade because it established security across much of Eurasia. This doesn't mean war never has causes worth fighting for, but it reminds us that peace has enormous value, that the prosperity commerce brings benefits everyone, that we lose something precious when conflicts make exchange impossible. Finally, the past is not as distant as we imagine. The Silk Road might seem ancient history, irrelevant to our modern concerns, but we live in a world the Silk Road helped create. The religions we practice, the technologies we use, the foods we eat, the art we admire, all bear Silk Road influences. And the questions the Silk Road raised remain relevant. How do we maintain connections across cultural differences? How do we balance openness to foreign influences with preservation of local identities? How do we build the infrastructure and institutions that enable cooperation? How do we prevent the dark side of exchange, disease, exploitation, conflict, while preserving the benefits? The Silk Road was never perfect. It was built by flawed humans pursuing profit in dangerous circumstances. People died on those routes. Cultures clashed, diseases spread, inequalities persisted. But something remarkable was achieved anyway. For over 1,000 years, civilizations that barely knew each other existed, maintained contact, exchanged goods and ideas, and enriched each other's lives. Merchants risked everything for profit and accidentally connected the world. Monks, traveling to spread their faith, accidentally spread knowledge. Empires competing for power accidentally created conditions for cultural flowering. This is the paradox and the promise of human connection. It's difficult, dangerous, and driven by mundane motives. But it creates something larger than any individual intention. A connected world where ideas circulate, technologies improve, cultures enrich each other, and the human experience expands. The Silk Road is gone. The caravans no longer cross those deserts. The oasis cities have declined. The trade goods have changed. But the fundamental challenge remains. How do we connect across differences? How do we build networks that enable cooperation while respecting diversity? How do we create shared prosperity while maintaining distinct identities? These questions don't have simple answers. The Silk Road didn't fully answer them either. But it showed us what's possible when we try. It showed us that connection, however imperfect, however dangerous, however slowly established, is worth pursuing. It showed us that the threads linking human civilizations, though invisible and fragile, are also remarkably durable. Standing here in our modern, globalized world, we are the inheritors of the Silk Road's legacy. The connections it forged, the exchanges it enabled, the lessons it taught, these are part of our heritage. Understanding that heritage, with all its complexity and ambiguity, helps us navigate our own age of global connection. The merchant standing at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, 2 years behind him, 2 years ahead, everything he owns loaded on camels. He's not so different from us. He faces uncertainty, danger, and the prospect of enormous reward or ruinous failure. He must cross a distance that seems impossible, navigate between cultures he doesn't fully understand, and trust that on the far side of hardship lies something worth having. We're all standing at the edge of our own deserts now, trying to connect across distances that seem impossible, navigate between cultures we don't fully understand, and trust that connection is worth the cost. The Silk Road can't tell us exactly how to do this, but it can remind us that humans have been attempting it for millennia, that success is possible, and that the attempt itself, however difficult, is part of what makes us human. And thank you for walking this route with me, from Chang'an to Constantinople, from the Han Dynasty to the Renaissance, from merchants to monks to the countless unknown people who built and maintained the greatest trade route in human history. Their journeys ended centuries ago, but their legacy continues. We are still walking the Silk Road even now. We just call it by other names. If this journey through history has sparked your curiosity about how our modern world connects to its ancient past, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. There are countless more stories to explore, countless more threads connecting our present to the past, countless more lessons we can learn from those who came before us. Until next time, safe travels, wherever your roads may lead.